It had been raining for hours, that thin, needling kind of rain that soaks your spirit before it soaks your skin. The streets glistened with reflections of brake lights and traffic signals, and people moved quickly, heads down, umbrellas clashing as they passed each other with practiced indifference. Inside the narrow grocery store on the corner of Grayson Street, Leona Grey stood behind the register, scanning canned soup and bread for an elderly man who mumbled thank yous without meeting her eyes. Her uniform, dark green with a faded name tag, hung slightly off her shoulders. The heater behind the till had stopped working weeks ago, and the damp had crept into her bones. Still, she greeted every customer with the same soft courtesy that rarely earned a response. She didn't mind. Not really. It was the kind of life she'd grown used to, one where you weren't seen unless something broke. That evening, as her shift was winding down, she glanced outside and saw an older woman struggling with her umbrella. The wind snapped it back like a cruel joke, and the woman laughed lightly at first, until her shopping bag tore and cans rolled into the street. No one stopped. A man stepped around her. A cyclist swerved. Someone even shook their head. Leona didn't hesitate. She pushed open the store door, letting the chime jingle behind her, and ran out into the rain. The woman, bundled in a deep navy coat and maroon scarf, had crouched to reach for a can, then froze. Her hand trembled. Her knees buckled. She collapsed against the curb like a doll that had tipped over. Leona dropped beside her, instinct driving every motion. "Can you hear me?" The woman's lips moved faintly. Her face was pale. Rain gathered on her lashes like tiny beads of glass. Leona slipped off her coat and draped it over the woman's shoulders, shielding her from the cold. She called for help, her voice calm but urgent, and gently held the woman's hand while they waited. Her fingers were cold, papery, and yet Leona squeezed them with the quiet fierceness of someone who knew what loneliness in crisis felt like. It took 10 minutes for the ambulance to arrive. 10 minutes of crouching in the rain, of murmured reassurances. "You're not alone. You're going to be okay. Help is coming." When the paramedics lifted the woman onto the stretcher, one of them looked at Leona and said, "You her daughter?" Leona shook her head. "No, I just didn't want her to be alone." She gathered the spilled groceries. The bag was ruined, so she used her own, and asked if she could ride with them. The paramedics agreed. At the hospital, she waited in a hard plastic chair for over 2 hours while the woman was checked, monitored, and kept for observation. Eventually, a nurse came out and said, "She's asking for the girl who came with her." Leona stepped into the dim hospital room, still damp and shivering, unsure if she should even be there. The woman looked up, her eyes clearer now. She smiled faintly. "You stayed?" Leona nodded. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. They told me I fainted." "Ridiculous, isn't it?" she said with an embarrassed laugh. "I'm Margaret Hartley." "Leona," she replied softly. Margaret reached for her purse beside the bed. Her hands were still unsteady. "Let me pay you back for the groceries. And for the trouble." Leona took a step back. "No, please. It's all right. Really." Margaret frowned. "But, you don't even know me." Leona shrugged, almost shyly. "You'd have done the same for me." That silenced the older woman. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked at Leona not as a stranger, not even as a helper, but as something rarer, a reflection of something she once believed still existed in the world. Margaret reached out and patted her hand. "Thank you, dear. You've done more than you know." Leona left the hospital just before midnight. She didn't tell anyone at work where she'd gone. She didn't mention the groceries she paid for out of her own wallet, the hours she stayed in soaked shoes, or the elderly woman's gratitude. She just returned to her small flat, hung her wet coat, and made a cup of tea that went cold while she stared out at the lights of the city. No one would ever write about it. It wouldn't change the rent. It wouldn't open any doors. But still, in the quiet corners of her heart, she felt something shift, as though, for once, the invisible part of her had been gently, briefly seen. It was 3 days before Leona saw her again. The weather had cleared. The skies were pale and dry. At the corner grocery store, a small crowd of customers filtered in and out, picking up milk, mints, and low-priced wine. Leona stood behind the counter, hair tucked behind her ears, scanning items and counting coins with the quiet focus of someone used to being background. Just after noon, the door chimed. She didn't look up right away. Only when she heard a voice, gentle, composed, say, "You're even more graceful than I remembered," did she glance toward the entrance. Mrs. Hartley was there. She looked different now, rested, brushed, and elegant. A silk scarf at her neck, soft leather gloves in one hand, and a paper bag from a nearby bakery in the other. Leona straightened in surprise. "Oh, hello. You're feeling better?" Margaret Hartley nodded, smiling. "Thanks to you." Before Leona could protest, she stepped forward and placed a small envelope on the counter. "I didn't get to do this properly at the hospital. I'd like to repay you." Leona opened the envelope slightly. A check, several £100. Enough to cover a month of rent and groceries. "Oh," she whispered. "That's too much." "It's not nearly enough," Margaret said. But Leona pushed the envelope gently back toward her. "Please. I really didn't do it for that." Mrs. Hartley paused, genuinely puzzled. "Then why?" Leona thought for a moment, her voice low. "Because one day, it might be me. Or someone I love. And I'd hope someone would stop and care." Margaret studied her face closely, not with the idle interest of someone who gives compliments, but with the attentiveness of someone weighing character. Finally, she said, "May I ask something personal?" Leona hesitated, then nodded. "What do you really want to do? Outside of this shop, I mean." The question hit like an arrow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was something Leona had buried so far down she'd forgotten it had once burned inside her. I don't know," she said at first. Then, after a beat, "Something that matters. Something that helps people. I've always wanted to work somewhere where I felt useful. But I probably won't ever get the chance." Mrs. Hartley said nothing for a long while. Just nodded, slowly. Then smiled. "You never know," she said. "The world has a funny way of circling back to people who move through it gently." Leona smiled faintly, touched but unconvinced. And then, just like that, Mrs. Hartley gathered her gloves, turned, and left. No phone numbers exchanged. No promises made. Just a kind goodbye and a lingering feeling that something rare had just passed through her life like a breeze. Warm but brief. Weeks passed. Then months. Leona applied for jobs, administrative assistant, receptionist, even office cleaner. Anything that might mean a desk, a warm lunchroom, and a little dignity. She got polite rejections, or worse, silence. Her savings thinned. She sold her old tablet. She began skipping breakfast. One night, while sorting through online job boards, she saw a listing for a small logistics company opening a new city office. She applied, again, not expecting much. She didn't notice the name of the parent company, Hartley & Cole. The name rang no bell. Why would it? She had never imagined Mrs. Hartley as anything other than a well-off older woman, gracious but ordinary. She had no idea the woman she once held in her arms on a rainy curb was the co-founder of one of the city's most respected consulting firms. All she knew was that she was tired, and if someone gave her a chance, she wouldn't waste it. The day of the interview arrived with a grey sky and the kind of cold that slid down the back of your collar. Leona wore her best clothes, a simple navy blouse, black trousers that didn't quite hold their press anymore, and a worn coat with fraying at the cuffs. She'd brushed her hair back tightly and carried her CV in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the drizzle. The building was modern, all glass and angles, and the lobby was warm, filled with the scent of expensive coffee and perfume that didn't come from bargain shelves. Leona walked in slowly, greeted the receptionist with a soft smile, and gave her name. The woman barely looked up. "You're early." "Yes. I wasn't sure how traffic would be. There's a lounge over there, the receptionist replied with thin indifference. We'll call you. Leona walked toward the lounge, but not before noticing the other applicants arriving. One wore a camel trench coat and patent heels. Another tapped confidently at her phone while sipping something from a gold thermos. They looked like they belonged in this place. Leona sat in the corner, clutching her file. She tried to rehearse answers in her head, but the words felt small. What were they looking for? People with experience? With presence? With polish? She had none of that. What she had was the ability to notice, to stay calm in storms, to carry weight that didn't belong to her and never ask for applause. But that didn't fit neatly into a bullet point resume. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. One of the other women laughed too loudly at something the receptionist said. Leona's hands were cold. And then, just as her name was about to be called, the elevator doors opened behind the reception desk with a quiet ding. And she walked in. Mrs. Hartley. But this was not the woman Leona remembered in a hospital gown or walking into the store with a bakery bag. This was the real version, or perhaps the public version. Tailored jacket, small diamond earrings, posture that suggested legacy. She looked older, stronger. A woman people listened to. Leona froze. Mrs. Hartley scanned the lobby, paused, and smiled as her eyes settled on her. Leona. Her voice cut through the air like silk. Leona stood up, unsure, half embarrassed to be seen in that old coat. But Mrs. Hartley walked straight to her and did something no one expected. She hugged her. Gently, warmly, as though they were old friends. Gasps fluttered among the other applicants. Mrs. Hartley pulled back and took Leona's hands in hers. I was hoping you'd apply. Leona blinked. You work here. Mrs. Hartley laughed softly. Leona, I built this place. The receptionist stood up, suddenly unsure of what to do. I'd like to speak with Miss Grey privately, Mrs. Hartley said, glancing briefly at the stunned woman behind the desk. She turned back to Leona. Come with me. Leona could barely nod. They entered the elevator. As the doors closed, the quiet hum of the world outside dimmed. For a moment, Leona could only stare at the numbers lighting up, each one lifting her into something unknown. Mrs. Hartley didn't speak until they reached the 7th floor. We've already met with the others, she said as they stepped out. But I wasn't sure if you'd apply. I didn't want to interfere. I wanted you to come on your own. Leona's heart was pounding. I don't understand. What is this? Mrs. Hartley smiled and led her to a quiet conference room. On the wall were blueprints and planning charts, but also pinned photographs of community projects, handwritten notes, and phrases like people first logistics and work with dignity. I started a new unit here, after we met. Something smaller, more personal, focused on humane systems, delivery models that care as much about the people as the parcels. It's an experiment, really. But it needs someone with heart. Someone who notices things that don't scream. Someone like you. Leona sat down slowly. You're not here to interview, Mrs. Hartley said, gently. You're here because I'd like to offer you a place at the table. I don't want you filling forms. I want you helping shape the form of something new. Leona's throat tightened. But I don't have the background. I don't have the language. Mrs. Hartley reached across the table, lightly touching her hand. But you have the eyes. And you have the heart. And in a world full of noise, that is rarer than any credential. The room was modest. No glass walls or sweeping city views. No chrome finishes or echoing space. Just a simple wooden desk, a round table in the corner, a soft rug on the floor, and a small window that framed the sky. It didn't look like a promotion. It looked like a beginning. Leona stood at the threshold, her hands still faintly trembling, the gravity of it all resting gently on her shoulders. Mrs. Hartley stood beside her, not with the proud air of a benefactor, but with quiet joy, as if she'd simply found something rare and was grateful to keep it close. We've been building this unit slowly, Mrs. Hartley explained. Carefully. It's not glamorous work. It's hours of meetings, tough calls, long days. But it matters. Leona looked around, still unsure. This can't be real, she whispered. I was supposed to be behind a counter yesterday. Mrs. Hartley turned to her. You weren't meant to stay behind a counter. You were just the only one kind enough to help when no one else did. Leona swallowed, her eyes stinging. But I didn't help you because of this, she said. I didn't even know who you were. Mrs. Hartley smiled. Exactly. There was a pause. A long, golden pause. Then she handed Leona a folder. Inside was her official offer letter. A role shaped around her instincts, her empathy, her natural leadership. Not charity. Not a favor. A role created because of who she was. Mrs. Hartley added softly, it's not just a job. You'll be helping build how we treat people, from drivers to warehouse staff to the way we handle complaints. Your decisions will matter. Leona didn't speak right away. She sat down, opened the file, and ran her fingers across the page. Then she looked up. I'll do it, she said. But I don't want to be anyone's project. I want to earn it. Mrs. Hartley's voice was firm. You already did. Almost a year later, Leona sat in the same room, now truly hers. The desk had a new lamp, a small plant that leaned toward the sun, and a framed photo of Mrs. Hartley standing beside her at a local outreach event. The plaque on the wall was simple, just one line, engraved in bronze. Built on a kindness that expected nothing. There was a soft knock. A young woman entered, nervous, clutching a folder. Her jacket was worn, and her voice was unsure. Sorry, they told me to wait here. I'm here for the community logistics internship. Leona smiled and stood, walking around the desk. No need to be nervous, she said warmly. We don't look for perfect here. The girl exhaled, visibly relieved. Come, Leona gestured. Tell me your story. And as they sat down together, just two people, no titles, no egos, Leona felt something rise quietly in her chest. Not pride, not power, just purpose. Kindness doesn't demand recognition, but sometimes, when it's least expected, the world gently turns back to say, I saw you. And in that turning, doors open not because they were knocked on, but because someone on the other side remembered the warmth of being held when they had fallen. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and stay with you.